Hey, Nathan here from PH Studios. Welcome back to another tutorial covering After Effects that is part of the TDCS. And last tutorial we talked about how to key effects like particle system or blur, and I also showed you the bulge. You can do that for any sort of effects that have a little stopwatch icon next to it, and you can do that however long you want to. You can do it as quick as you want to. You can make it an easy ease transition, which means it starts slow, it speeds up, and then slows down, so it's a smooth transition. You can do all sorts of stuff with that. So this tutorial is going to be the last After Effects for the TDCS, and this is just going to cover a basic game introduction video. Like, you'll have your game starting up, and then this will be your video. Now, for the very basic tutorial and very basic introduction video, I did something pretty simple, which is just animate the text and animate the particle system. That's about it. If you've watched my audio showcase and audio videos, you have seen this effect somewhat before. A few modifications here and there, but it's basically the same effect. And then I'll show you how to create that. And I also decided to make this about 10 seconds long for a very basic technique. I don't think your users want to be sitting there for 30 seconds to see something like this. But anyway, this is what we'll be creating. And that goes on for another 2 seconds. Then we can fade it to black or do anything you want. You can color it differently and all the stuff you want to. It's completely customizable. So let me go ahead and close this. I will provide this sample to you. It's a pretty quick sample. I just created it. Alright, so I will show you how to create a new one. So let's create a new composition. And this will also be included in the project file. That's why I'm doing this inside of the a file as well. And let's call this intro tutorial. Make it 720p HD 29.97 and 10 seconds. Click OK. Alright, so now the very basic technique of this is I have the title action safe on. At default it is off, so just click, we have the little 50% the zoom level here. So just click the icon just to the right of that, and you'll see title/action safe. This will allow me to center the text inside that plus sign. Okay, so go up here to the text layer and type in your website or company productions or something like that. Alright. Accept the changes by holding Control and press Enter on Windows, or holding Command and press Enter on Mac. And we can center this up if you want to. And I did a color change for the .com. You do not have to. So we just have to go back to that text layer and just select the .com. Change the character color here. And I just made it darker. And maybe the PH Studios a little bit brighter. Okay. Now it's completely customizable. You can change the colors of each character individually just by modifying this text layer. Okay. So accept those changes again by just clicking off of it or pressing Command Enter or Control Enter. Command Enter on Windows, Command Enter on Mac, Control Enter on Windows, and that'll accept the changes. Then we can move it around. It looks like it's already positioned properly, so that's good. Alright, so now I want to transition this from off to on in a smooth transition. So what I used for the sample is I created a new layer, solid, and it was a black layer, and I called this transition. I make sure the comp size is clicked, and then there's the new solid. Now I used effect, transition, and linear wipe. So I wanted this effect to last about 2 seconds long. You can speed it up or slow it down. So what I did here is I created a keyframe here at 0%. And at 2 seconds long, I set it to 100%. So now it is fully on and we can see the transition. But it's not a smooth transition. We have that hard cutoff of the letters here. So you have a feather option here, and you can increase the feather, and there's that smooth transition. I'm going to decrease it just a little bit. Okay. So now you need that particle system to flow with that transition. And a very basic way to do that is, let's create a new solid. Let's call it particles. Make sure the comp size is clicked. And let's go with the greenish or bluish color. A little bit more blue. Okay, so now I have the blue particles. Let's go to Effect, Simulation, CC Particle World. And let's turn off all the grids. Now, I usually like to turn off all the grids except for when I need to animate the position. So I'm going to leave the position grid on because I want to see where the X is, that blue X, where that is. I can take off the title action safe. Where that blue X is, I want to see that position. Alright, so let's go ahead and time, and let's change the particle to lens convex, and that's pretty big, so I changed the birth size and death size on my sample. Okay, that looks good. I just changed it to 0.06 and 0.04. And let's go to physics and take off that gravity. And the velocity needs to be about 0.5. Or maybe even a little bit lower. We don't want it to fly out too far. So that looks good. Now we need to animate it. So what we need to do here is we need to move the position. We have the producer's position. We need to move that position to wherever the transition point is. Now, you can be completely flexible here if you want to. I like to do it right on the center of that transition. You might prefer it to be a little bit ahead of it or a little bit behind it. I'm going to choose right in the middle. Once I have that point, I'm going to set up a keyframe for this position X value here. So I enabled the stopwatch, and now I can make a keyframe. So, a cool tip here is you have a page up and page down on your keyboard. If you press page up, you'll move behind a keyframe, one single frame of the composition. If you press page down, you'll go forward a frame. So I'm going to move forward or backwards one frame so I can line that up. Line that up, move forward. Alright, it's completely gone now. Okay, so at the point where it's completely gone, I want to set a keyframe for the birth rate. Remember, the birth rate is at 2.0, and I'm going to set it to 0. Now I'm going to go forward, so page down, 3 frames. And I'm going to set that to 2.0. So the birth rate will slowly turn on. Of course, I hid this layer, so there it is. So the birth rate will slowly turn on. Now I need to go to the very end of this composition, so I can scrub through the timeline. And at this point right here, I want the position to be at the far edge of the .com, the far right edge. So I just move the X, so I move that to position X over to the right side of .com. So right there. And at this point, I need to select the particles layer and press U to bring up all the keyframes that I have made before, and I need to set a keyframe for the birth rate. I leave it at 2.0 because we want it to go from 0 to 2.0, then later on 2.0 to 0. So page down until you find a decent place to stop. How about right here? I'll set that to 0. Alright, so let's do a RAM preview and see what that looks like. So a pretty simple technique. You just need to make sure the position of the producer, up here, the position X, will follow the transition. And sometimes it'll be a little bit behind, sometimes it might be ahead. I'm not going to care about that at this point. You can go in and modify every single keyframe if you want to make it match up perfectly, but I think it looks pretty good. And then once that transition stops, so it's fully on, I want to turn off the birth rate. So that's all we did here. We slowly turn the birth rate on, and we slowly turn it off after the transition. Okay. Now, what else I did in the sample is I duplicated this particles layer. I selected the layer and duplicated it. Either edit duplicate or Command D on Mac, Control D on Windows, and this will duplicate the layer. And I did some modifications, like the physics. I increased the velocity just a little bit, and I changed the producer offset. So I offset the Y just a little bit. Just a little bit. And then I rotated the layer, so you can get the rotate tool here and rotate it. Something like that. Now if we do a RAM preview, we have two separate particle systems. You can do complete modifications to the one above, and the two particle systems work together fairly well. Of course, you can increase the velocity a lot more, and they'll be farther away. But you don't want something like that. You can even decrease the particle size or increase the particle size. Something like that. That might be too big. But you get the idea. You can manipulate the particle system above, but I would not change any keyframes because that will mess up the transition. So I'm actually going to make this a little bit smaller instead of larger. Alright. So, the final thing I did for this sample is I created a layer, adjustment layer, and the adjustment layer, I think I mentioned in the past, is it modifies every single layer below it. So if I distort this layer, it'll distort every single layer below it. If I change its color of this layer, it'll change the color of everything below it. So what I did is I created an effect a color correction, and a tint. And that tinted everything below it. And as it was moving, as the transition was occurring, it was tinted. At this point here, where the particle system begins to fade, I set the keyframe for the amount to tint, and then when the particle system is completely gone or close to it, I set it to 0. So if we do a RAM preview, it'll bring that color back that we have in that text. Alright. So, now that we have that, the other thing you will notice is for the intro we have the phstudios.com, but we also have the tower defense. So, what we need to do for this one is we need to select all the layers we just created, right click, you can't see that, so we could just go to layer, pre-compose, and let's call this PH Studios or whatever you labeled it as, your company or something as a composition name. Move all attributes to a new composition. So everything we just created is in a brand new composition called PH Studios. Okay, so I had to recompose this into a different name because I have another PH Studios here. So when you go to your project, you will see your composition that you just created. I labeled it PH Studios Tutorial so that it would be different from this one. Okay, so the intro tutorial has a PH Studios tutorial composition in it. Now, I want to duplicate the composition. Now, it's a bad idea to duplicate it here because that just duplicates that instance of the composition. I want to duplicate the entire composition. So I have to go to the project here, find the composition I just created, and duplicate that. Okay, so now I want to change this to game title tutorial. So here I'm going to double click this game title tutorial, the duplicated PH Studios tutorial composition. I'm going to double click that, and as you can see, it's an exact copy of what we created before. Now I want to create the tower defense title, or whatever you want to call your game. So I'm going to go to the full completed transitioned state, and I'm going to change this to tower defense. And see if everything lines up properly. Looks like it does. Alright, so that's all we have to do is change the tower defense. But you also want to make sure that everything lines up properly. For example, if we just call this tower, we do not want the particle system to be over here. We want to adjust the particle system's keyframes to where it ends on the R instead of the E. So you want to make sure everything lines up properly, and don't worry about the large font size. We will get to that in just a second. So once we have that, we can drag this game title tutorial into this composition, and now we have both compositions in our project. And if we do a RAM preview, we will see they're exact same, except for the text is differently. Now you can modify the particle systems if you want to. I did not do that in this tutorial or sample. So if you want the tower defense to start after the PH Studios ends, like I did in the other video, go to a point where there is no more particle system and go forward just a little bit more. Drag the layer here to that point. So it'll look something like this. In the timeline, drag that layer to the right of that vertical line here. So now if we do a RAM preview, the phstudios.com will end and the tower defense one will start. And if we bring this up a little bit more, we have that complete black sample that we have an issue with, because it's fully on at this point. If we go back to this, that black transition is fully on, which means it's hiding everything below it. Now, we can fix that. We want the tower defense to be below the PH Studios, so we can just put that layer below the PH Studios. And now we have that PH Studios stays on. It's because that transition, that giant black solid that we created, if we leave the game tutorial above it, everything below that layer will be hidden until that transition is on. So just readjust those layers, and now we have it set appropriately. Now, the final thing I did for this sample, and we'll discuss this right now, is that I created these layers, 3D layers. What you can do to do that is to just check these boxes here. It looks like a 3D cube. Inside that column, just check those two boxes. So now we have a vertical, horizontal, and Z-axis line. It's a little bit blue here. It's this thing right here. So what you want to do is you want to move this either forward or backwards inside of space. You can hold the shift key to move it even faster. Without the shift key, this is the result. With the shift key, this is the result. So I'm going to hold down the shift key and I'm going to move it backwards in space so we get that small font. A little bit smaller. Alright. So now, once that's pushed back in Z space, I can move it to wherever I want. I can move it up here, down here. That's where I had it in the sample. Wherever I want to, I can rotate it, and it rotates it in 3D as well. So I can rotate it like this, and it will be a 3D effect if you want to do it that way. That might look cool. So let's go ahead and look at that, and look at that. So I'm going to take off that rotation I just did, and I'm going to move it to the top. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you can create a cool introduction video to your game. And of course, I said you can completely do a fade to black at the end of this video. So what you can do is you can create a layer new solid. Let's make it black. Make sure the comp size is clicked. And let's say it'll be a 1 second transition. At the very end of the video, it will be a 1 second transition. Be sure the opacity is 0. Enable the keyframe. Go to the very end of the composition and set it to 100%. So now we have a fade to black. And that's it. And when you move that layer in Z space, when you moved it to where it was appearing to be a very small object, the particle system also changed. So it looks very small, and it looks kind of cool that way. Alright. So, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. This is the last tutorial of After Effects for the TDCS. I will continue doing After Effects, but it will not be part of the TDCS. You will have access to this project. Let me go ahead and save it. You will have access to this project file. It'll be labeled GameIntroduction.aep. You will have the Tower Defense intro, the one I created, and the tutorial, the one I did for the tutorial, right here. So you'll have two different things to look at, and all your solids go in the solid layer. Alright, so this is what we'll use for the introduction of our game. It'll be a quick introduction, 10-second, 5-second, and then we'll go on to the game itself. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed the After Effects series, and I hope you stay tuned for the other Photoshop and GarageBand tutorials. And soon we will start the actual development of the game. I hope to see you next time.